So now that we know which key was pressed and how we can get its inner HTML, how can we play a different sound depending on which key was pressed? Well, you might think to the if-else statements that we learned in our Introduction to JavaScript modules. But there's actually 7 keys in total, so we would have to write quite a few if-else statements. Now, in this scenario, it would actually be easier to write what's called a switch statement, which, just like a railroad switch, it will take the code down a different track depending on the value of a variable. So let's delete this line of code and let's start writing our switch statements. Now, inside Atom, as soon as you start writing the word switch, then our autosuggest will helpfully give you the skeleton of a JavaScript switch statement. So if you hit enter, then it'll give you the bare bones of what it should look like. So you can see the keyword here, instead of if, is switch. And then afterwards, we have a set of parentheses, which includes the expression or the thing that we're going to switch on. And in our case, we're going to switch on the letter that is inside the inner HTML of each of these buttons. So let's create a variable that holds that value. So we'll call it button inner HTML, and we'll set it to equal this. So remember, that's the button that triggered the event, dot inner HTML. So now let's switch the button's inner HTML, and depending on the case, we'll tell it to do something different. So the first case is if that was equal to W. So remember, our first button has an inner HTML of the letter W. So if it was the letter W, then we're going to tell it to play the Tom1 drum. So I'm going to take that code that I commented out and then put it in here so that it will play the first drum. Now, after the first case is done, then there is a break statement, which tells the code to exit the switch statement and continue with the rest of the code. Now, if button HTML didn't happen to be equal to W, then it could be equal to something else. So in that case, we would have to specify the next likely scenario, which is, what if the inner HTML was A, i.e. the second button got clicked? Well, in this case, we're going to play the next sound instead, and we're going to play the tom2.mp3. And once again, we have to end our case with a break. So the switch statement looks a little bit weird, because instead of having, say, for example, an open parentheses here and a closing parentheses here, it actually has a colon and a break keyword instead. But just know that it's basically the same thing. Between the colon and the break keyword are all the things we want the website to carry out if the button inner HTML was equal to this particular case. Both are, now in this case, instead of calling both of our sounds audio, we should really give it a different name. So why don't we call our first one the sound that it's going to make, so Tom1, and our second one Tom2, after the sound file that's going to be played. And remember, if you're going to change it here, then you have to change it here as well, so that you know that you're playing Tom1 and you're playing Tom2. Now, I've just gone in and added all of the remaining cases for the key S, D, J, K, and L. So now I've gone in and I've added all of the other remaining cases so that our website knows what to do if the S key was pressed, or the D, or the J, K, L. Now, the final case that we've got is actually the default case. Now, the default is kind of like the else statement at the end of an if. It covers all of the other scenarios that we haven't specified. What if the button inner HTML wasn't WASD, and instead it was something like 1 or comma? Well, that's when the default will trigger. Now, even though in most cases the default will likely never be triggered, it's still good practice to include it, as you can't always predict ahead of time what might go wrong in the future, right? And the value could always be something that you didn't expect. So let's just go ahead and add a console log that logs the button inner HTML that triggered the default case. So let's hit save, refresh our website, and you can see now if I click on any of these buttons, you can see that we get a different sound for each button click. That's pretty cool, right? Now, in the next lesson, we're going to dig into keyboard events and see how we can use the keyboard to trigger these sounds instead of having to press on the buttons. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.